Outlaw's widow shared supper. Until the guest pulled out her husband's gun, she thought loneliness was the cruelest companion on the frontier, until a stranger knocked at her door, carrying secrets that would shatter everything she believed about the man she'd buried. The silence had become Clara's closest friend. It lived in the corners of the one-room cabin, settled thick as dust on Jake's empty chair, and whispered through the gaps in the chinked logs when the prairie wind stirred. 3 months had passed since she'd buried her husband beneath the cottonwood tree. 3 months since consumption had stolen his rattling breath in the dead of winter. Now autumn painted the grasslands gold, and Clara had learned to find comfort in the quiet rhythms of survival. She sat by the window in the fading light, mending a torn work shirt with careful, practiced stitches. Her needle caught the last amber rays of sun, and she squinted at the worn fabric. Everything in the cabin bore the marks of use and reuse. The patched quilts, the dented tin cups, the chair legs wrapped with strips of leather where the wood had cracked. Jake's rifle still hung above the door, gathering dust like everything else he'd left behind. The beans simmered on the wood stove, filling the small space with their earthy smell. Clara had learned to cook for one, though her portions remained generous out of habit. Sometimes she caught herself setting 2 plates before remembering. The loneliness wasn't cruel anymore. It was simply there, like the wind or the endless sky. A sound broke through her thoughts. Hoofbeats, slow and deliberate, approaching from the east where the dirt trail wound between the hills. Clara set down her mending and moved to the window, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. A rider emerged from the dusk, hunched in his saddle, leading a tired-looking mare. He rode like a man who'd traveled far and expected to travel farther still. The stranger reined in near the water trough and sat for a long moment, studying the cabin. Clara watched him from behind the faded curtain. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that curled beneath a weathered hat. His clothes spoke of the trail, dusty boots, worn denim, a coat that had seen too many nights under stars. When he finally dismounted, his movements carried the careful stiffness of a man who'd spent more days in the saddle than he cared to count. He walked to her door with measured steps, and his knock came soft but firm. 3 gentle raps that somehow managed to sound respectful rather than demanding. Clara hesitated, her hand resting on the door handle. Visitors were rare this far from town, and a woman alone had reason to be cautious. But something in the rhythm of his knock spoke of manners rather than menace. She opened the door part way, keeping her body behind the thick wood. The stranger stood with his hat in his hands, and she could see his face clearly now, weathered but kind, with eyes that held a deep sadness she recognized. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 35, with lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into distant horizons. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice soft and careful. "I don't mean to trouble you, but I've been riding since dawn, and I was wondering if you might spare a drink of water for myself and my horse." Clara studied his face in the lamplight that spilled from her cabin. His eyes didn't dart or calculate the way dangerous men's eyes did. Instead, they held steady and patient, waiting for her answer without presumption. She noticed his hands, scarred and calloused, but empty of threat. "Water's free to anyone who asks politely," she said, opening the door wider. "Trough's full. Much obliged." He moved toward his horse with that same careful grace, and Clara watched him from the doorway. The mare drank deeply while he loosened her saddle, his hands gentle on her neck. The horse was road-weary but well cared for, her coat brushed despite the dust of travel. The smell of beans drifted out into the evening air, and Clara saw the stranger's nostrils flare slightly. When had he last eaten a proper meal? The question rose unbidden, along with a memory of her mother's voice. A stranger fed might be an angel unaware, Clara. Never send a soul away hungry if you have food to share. Those beans smell like they've been cooked by someone who knows what they're about, the stranger said, not quite looking at her. There was no begging in his voice, no manipulation, just a quiet statement of fact. Clara felt something stir in her chest, something that had been sleeping since Jake's death. Not attraction, exactly, but recognition. This man carried loneliness the way she did, like a familiar burden that had worn smooth from constant handling. "I cooked more than I can eat," she heard herself say. "If you're not in a hurry to be somewhere else, you're welcome to share them." The stranger paused in his tending of the mare, his hands still on the saddle leather. When he looked at her, something passed between them, an understanding of what it meant to be alone on the vast prairie, of what it cost to trust a stranger in the gathering dark. "That's kind of you, ma'am. Very kind indeed." He straightened slowly, and she could see the relief in his shoulders. "Name's Thomas. Thomas Whitmore." "Clara," she replied, stepping back from the door. "Clara Morrison." As Thomas secured his horse and gathered his saddlebags, Clara returned to her stove, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for a second plate. She told herself it was simply kindness, the same mercy she'd show any traveler. But as she listened to his boots on her doorstep, she wondered what other hungers besides food might be fed by sharing a simple meal in the lamplight, and whether some kinds of loneliness were more dangerous than others. Over cornbread and beans, she spoke of her husband's trading work while he shared his 3-year hunt for justice, neither knowing that every word they exchanged deepened the cruel irony that would soon shatter them both. The cornbread steamed between them like a prayer made manifest. Clara had split it down the middle, the golden crumbs scattering across the worn wooden table that had witnessed 1,000 meals before this one. Thomas sat across from her, his long fingers wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had gone cold, while he watched her move about the small space with quiet efficiency. "Been a while since I sat at a proper table," he said, his voice carrying the reverence of a man who'd grown accustomed to eating from his lap beside cold campfires. He broke off a piece of cornbread and chewed it slowly, as if trying to memorize the taste of something made with care rather than mere necessity. Clara poured beans into his bowl, the savory steam rising between them. "A while since I cooked for more than just myself," she admitted. The admission surprised her. She hadn't meant to reveal even that small truth about the emptiness of her days. "Your husband away on business?" Thomas asked, and Clara felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever someone spoke of Jake in the present tense. "He passed," she said simply, reaching for the salt. 3 months back. Consumption took him in the end. Thomas set down his spoon, and the silence stretched between them like a held breath. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said finally, and something in his voice made Clara look up from her own bowl. His eyes held the weight of someone who understood loss intimately, not just as a polite observer, but as a fellow traveler on grief's long road. "Thank you," she said, surprised by how much those simple words meant coming from a stranger. He was a good man in his way. Did trading work mostly buying and selling goods between the towns. Kept us fed and housed. The words came easier than she'd expected, perhaps because Thomas was a stranger who would disappear with the dawn, taking her small confidences with him. Thomas nodded and returned to his meal, but Clara caught something flicker across his features, a tightening around his eyes that spoke of his own familiarity with the euphemisms people use to describe men's work when the truth might be harder to stomach. "What brings you through this way?" Clara asked, settling into her own chair. The domestic ritual of sharing a meal had awakened something in her that had been dormant for months. The simple human pleasure of conversation, of voices filling a space that had known only silence. Thomas chewed thoughtfully before answering. "Looking for someone," he said, his gaze fixed on the amber liquid in his cup. "Been looking for 3 years now. That's a long search. Some things are worth the time." His voice carried an edge now, something harder beneath the gentle manner. "My brother was killed in a trading dispute up near Dodge City. Man who did it disappeared before the law could catch up to him. I've been following his trail ever since." Clara felt her throat constrict slightly. The world of trading could be dangerous. She'd known that much about Jake's work, though he'd always been careful to spare her the details. Men carried guns for protection, and sometimes protection wasn't enough. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it. "That must be a terrible burden to carry." Thomas looked up at her then, and she saw something raw in his expression. Billy was just 19, sweet as honey and twice as trusting. He should never have been mixed up in that kind of business, but times were hard. and he needed the work. He paused, running his thumb along the rim of his cup. The man who killed him shot an unarmed boy in the back during what should have been a simple exchange of goods for money. The beans turned to ash in Clara's mouth. She set down her spoon carefully, fighting the sudden churning in her stomach. Jake had mentioned disputes, men who didn't honor their agreements, the necessity of being prepared for trouble. But he'd always presented it as defensive, good men protecting themselves from bad ones. "That's awful," she managed, her voice smaller than she'd intended. The witness said the killer was a man named Jake Morrison. Rode with a couple of other fellows, but he was the one who pulled the trigger. Thomas's voice had gone flat and distant, as if he were reciting facts from a report rather than describing the moment that had carved the heart from his life. "I've been tracking him ever since. Trail led me through these parts." Clara's hand trembled as she reached for her water glass. Morrison was Jake's name, but it was common enough. There had to be dozens of Jake Morrisons scattered across the territories. The sick feeling in her stomach was just coincidence, just the natural sympathy anyone would feel hearing such a story. "Have you found any trace of him?" she asked, hating herself for the question, but unable to stop it from escaping. Thomas shook his head slowly. "Trail went cold about 6 months back. Last anyone saw of him, he was headed south, probably looking to lie low until the heat died down. But men like that don't just disappear. They surface eventually, usually when they think enough time has passed." Clara forced herself to take another bite of cornbread, though it might as well have been sawdust. She thought of Jake in his final weeks, the way he'd grown thin and pale, the way he'd sometimes stared at the ceiling in the dark hours before dawn as if wrestling with ghosts she couldn't see. She'd attributed it to the illness, the knowledge that he was dying. But now she wondered if there had been other weights on his conscience. "What will you do if you find him?" she asked. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his hand still around the coffee cup. "I've asked myself that question 1,000 times," he said finally. "Started out thinking I'd kill him. Eye for an eye, you know? But 3 years is a long time to carry that kind of anger. It changes a man. Changes him how? Makes you wonder if adding more death to the world would really honor the life that was taken." He looked up at her, and Clara saw something vulnerable in his expression. Billy always said violence just bred more violence. Said there had to be better ways for men to settle their differences. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. For Thomas's lost brother. For the weight this man had carried across so many miles. For the way grief could hollow a person out and fill them with questions that had no good answers. "He sounded like he was wise," she said softly. "Wiser than me." Thomas managed a sad smile. "Sometimes I think he'd be disappointed in the man I've become, chasing shadows across half the continent. But I can't seem to stop. It's like that search is the only thing holding me together." They finished their meal in companionable silence, the weight of shared sorrows settling between them like a familiar friend. Clara found herself studying Thomas's face in the lamplight, the gentle lines around his eyes, the way his mouth curved downward even in repose, the careful way he held his grief like something precious and fragile. When he finally pushed back from the table, she felt an unexpected pang of loss. The evening had reminded her of what it felt like to be human again, to exist as something more than just a keeper of memories in an empty house. "That was the finest meal I've had in months," Thomas said, standing slowly. "I'm grateful for your kindness, Mrs. Morrison. More grateful than I can properly express." Clara began clearing the dishes, her movements automatic. "It was good to have the company," she admitted. "It's quiet out here." Thomas moved toward his saddlebags, which he'd set near the door, and Clara felt the evening slipping away like water through her fingers. In the morning, he would ride on, carrying his burden of grief and purpose, and she would return to the silence that had become both comfort and curse. But as she watched him reach into his coat, she noticed something that made her breath catch. The handle of the gun, worn smooth from handling, with what looked like initials carved into the grip. And though the light was dim and her angle uncertain, those initials looked disturbingly familiar. She was clearing the supper dishes when her guest reached into his coat, not for payment or thanks, but for the gun that had belonged to her dead husband, carved with initials that made her blood run cold. The dishes clinked together in Clara's hands like distant church bells as she carried them to the wash basin. The sound seemed too loud in the small cabin, each piece of tin and ceramic announcing itself against the silence that had settled between them. Thomas remained at the table, his fingers drumming a slow, unconscious rhythm against the wood worn smooth by years of meals and conversations and the simple weight of living. "Let me help with those," he said, starting to rise, but Clara waved him back down. "You're a guest," she said, pumping water into the basin. "Guests don't do dishes." The domesticity of the moment felt both natural and strange. How long had it been since someone had offered to help her with even the smallest tasks? Jake had been many things, but helpful around the cabin had never been one of them. He'd always been preparing to leave or recovering from his return, his mind already racing ahead to the next opportunity, the next deal that would finally set them up proper. Clara scrubbed at the bean pot with more force than necessary, trying to shake off the unease that had been growing since Thomas mentioned the name Jake Morrison. Common name, she told herself again. Had to be dozens of them scattered across the territories. The fact that her husband had carried a gun and done dangerous work didn't make him a killer of innocent boys. "Mrs. Morrison," Thomas said behind her, and something in his voice made her hands still in the soapy water. "I need to show you something." She turned, drying her hands on her apron, and felt her heart stumble at the expression on his face. The gentle, grief-worn features had hardened into something more purposeful, more resolved. His hand rested inside his coat, and Clara found herself taking a step backward without meaning to. "What is it?" she asked, though part of her already knew, had known from the moment she saw the gun handle at his side, had known in the sick turning of her stomach when he spoke her dead husband's name. Thomas drew his hand from his coat slowly, deliberately, as if giving her time to prepare for what was coming. The gun emerged into the lamplight like a serpent from its den, a Colt revolver with a walnut grip worn smooth from handling. Even from across the small room, Clara could see the initials carved into the wood near the cylinder, JM. Her legs gave out, and she sank onto the wooden chair beside the wash basin, her wet hands leaving dark prints on her skirt. The gun seemed to fill the entire cabin, its presence warping the air between them until breathing became a conscious effort. "Where did you get that?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer. Thomas set the weapon on the table with infinite care, the metal making a soft sound against the wood. "I took it from Jake Morrison after I found him," he said, his voice gentle despite the words it carried. 3 weeks ago, up near Amarillo. He was already dying when I caught up to him. Consumption, just like you said. Barely had the strength to lift his head when I walked into that boarding house room." Clara stared at the gun, as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. She recognized it now. Jake had carried it for as long as she'd known him, claimed it had been his father's. He cleaned it regularly, lovingly, the way other men might tend to a favorite horse or a prize tool. She'd never questioned where it had been or what it might have done in the years before she'd met him. "You're saying my husband killed your brother," she said, the words falling like stones into still water. "I'm saying the man who killed my brother was named Jake Morrison, and he carried this gun." Thomas's voice remained steady, but Clara could see the tremor in his hands. "I'm saying I followed that trail for 3 years, through 5 territories and a dozen towns, asking after a tall man with dark hair and a scar on his left hand from a knife fight in his younger days." Clara's eyes dropped to her own hands, remembering the thin white line that had run from Jake's thumb to his wrist. He'd told her it came from helping a friend shoe a fractious horse, but she'd always wondered about the practiced way he'd moved when he told the story, as if he'd rehearsed it. "When I found him, he was already more ghost than man," Thomas continued. "Could barely speak above a whisper. But when I showed him this gun, when I told him why I'd come, he didn't deny it. Just looked at me with these hollow eyes and said he was sorry. Said he'd been sorry every day since it happened." The room seemed to tilt around Clara. Everything she thought she knew about her life, her marriage, her husband's character, was sliding away like sand through an hourglass. Jake the traitor, Jake the provider, Jake, the man who'd held her gently on cold nights and promised her a better life once the next deal came through. That man was dissolving, leaving behind someone she'd never truly known. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Your husband said it was supposed to be simple. A trade, goods for money. But something went wrong." Billy was nervous, kept reaching for something in his coat, and Jake thought he was going for a weapon. Thomas picked up the gun, turning it over in his hands. "Turns out my brother was reaching for a letter from his sweetheart, girl named Mary who lived back in Missouri. He'd been reading it over and over, getting up the courage to ask Jake's advice about whether he should marry her." Clara felt the tears come then, hot and silent down her cheeks. Not just for Thomas's brother, though her heart broke for that sweet boy who'd died with love letters in his pocket. Not just for Thomas, who'd spent 3 years of his life chasing a ghost across an unforgiving landscape. But for Jake, too, for the way that single moment of fear and bad judgment had poisoned the rest of his days, had turned him into a man who could never quite meet his own eyes in the mirror. He said he tried to take it back. Thomas continued, his voice growing softer. Soon as he realized what he'd done, he tried to help Billy, but it was too late. The boy died right there in the dust, asking for his mama with his last breath. "And you?" Clara asked, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "What did you do when you found him?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the gun in his hands. "I sat with him," he said finally. "For 2 days I sat in that boarding house room and listened to him tell me about Billy's last words, about the nightmares he'd had every night since, about how he'd tried to drink the memory away, and when that didn't work, tried to outrun it. He told me about you, about how you were the only good thing in his life, how you deserved better than a man with blood on his hands." Clara felt something break open in her chest. "You sat with him while he died. Someone should have. And I needed to understand who he really was. Not just the man who killed my brother, but the man who'd carried that guilt for 3 years, who'd loved you enough to try to protect you from the truth of what he'd done." The silence that followed felt different from the comfortable quiet they'd shared over dinner. This was the silence of a world that had shifted on its axis, of two people trying to find their footing on ground that was no longer solid beneath their feet. "I should hate you," Clara said finally, looking up at Thomas through her tears. "You came here hunting my husband. You took his gun." "Yes," Thomas said simply. "You should." But even as she said it, Clara knew it wasn't true. The man sitting across from her wasn't the vengeful hunter she might have expected. He was just another soul broken by the same violence that had claimed his brother, that had poisoned her husband's final years, that had left her alone in a cabin full of half-truths and careful omissions. "What happens now?" she asked. Thomas looked at the gun in his hands, then at Clara, then at the gun again. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending dust skittering across the porch. The sound seemed to come from another world, a simpler place where widows shared suppers with strangers and the dead stayed buried with their secrets. "I don't know," Thomas said, and for the first time since he'd knocked on her door, his voice carried no certainty at all. She stared at the gun that had killed an innocent boy, her hands trembling with the weight of her husband's hidden sins. But what she chose to do next would prove that mercy can heal wounds that revenge never could. The gun lay between them on the table like a sleeping serpent, its metal surface catching the lamplight and throwing it back in cold, accusing gleams. Clara's hands had stopped trembling, but something deeper inside her continued to shake. The foundations of everything she'd believed about love, about marriage, about the man who'd shared her bed and her dreams for 7 years. Thomas sat motionless in his chair, waiting. The weight of 3 years' worth of purpose hung around his shoulders like a mantle he'd grown tired of carrying. His fingers, which had been so gentle breaking cornbread earlier, now lay flat and still on the table, as if he'd forgotten how to move them. "Tell me about Billy," Clara said finally, her voice hoarse from crying. "Not how he died. Tell me how he lived." Thomas looked up, surprise flickering across his weathered features. Of all the things he might have expected her to say, this wasn't among them. "Billy." He cleared his throat, and something in his face softened. Billy laughed like summer rain, sudden and bright and impossible to ignore. He had this way of finding joy in the smallest things. A good cup of coffee. A horse that minded its manners. The sound of birds singing at dawn. Thomas's voice grew stronger as he spoke, as if the memories were giving him substance. He was going to be a teacher when he saved enough money. Wanted to build a school somewhere that needed one. Maybe find himself a wife who shared his love of books and learning. Clara closed her eyes, trying to picture this young man with his dreams and his sweetheart's letters. What was his favorite book? The Bible, mostly, though not in a preachy way. He just liked the stories, the poetry of the language. But he also loved Shakespeare. Carried a worn copy of Hamlet everywhere he went. Thomas almost smiled. Used to quote it when he thought no one was listening. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. That was his favorite line. The silence stretched between them again, but it felt different now. Less like a chasm and more like a bridge they were both afraid to cross. Jake used to quote things too, Clara said quietly. Not Shakespeare. Just little sayings his mother taught him when he was young. What's done can't be undone, but what's to come is still unwritten. He said that a lot, especially toward the end. Thomas studied her face. Did he know? About the baby Billy's girl was carrying? Clara's breath caught. There was a baby? Mary wrote about it in her last letter. The one Billy was carrying when... Thomas stopped, unable to finish the sentence. She lost it when word came about Billy's death. Grief took both of them. The magnitude of the ripples spread out before Clara like stones thrown into still water. Not just Billy dead, not just Thomas consumed by vengeance, not just Jake poisoned by guilt, but a young woman destroyed by loss, a child who would never be born, love letters that had become evidence of dreams that would never be fulfilled. How do we carry this? Clara whispered. How do we live with knowing all the ways one moment of fear destroyed so many lives? Thomas reached for the gun, his movements slow and deliberate. He held it up to the lamplight, studying Jake's initials as if they might provide answers to questions he'd been asking for 3 years. I came here thinking I knew what justice looked like, he said. Thought it meant finding your husband and making him pay for what he'd taken from me. But he was already paying, wasn't he? Had been paying every day since it happened. That doesn't bring Billy back. No, nothing can do that. Thomas set the gun down again, but this time he pushed it toward the center of the table, away from both of them. But I'm starting to think maybe justice isn't about evening the scales. Maybe it's about stopping the bleeding. Clara stared at the weapon that had caused so much pain. In the flickering lamplight, it looked smaller somehow, less menacing. Just a tool that had been used badly, carrying the weight of choices made in fear and desperation. What would Billy want, she asked. If he could speak for himself, what would he tell you to do? Thomas was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He'd want me to forgive. Billy always believed that forgiveness was the only thing that could break the cycle of hurt. Said holding on to anger was like swallowing poison and expecting the other person to die. Thomas looked up at Clara with eyes that held a lifetime of weariness. But I don't know how to forgive. I've been angry for so long. I'm not sure who I'd be without it. Clara reached across the table, not for the gun, but for Thomas's hand. His fingers were cold and rough, scarred from years of hard travel and harder choices. When she touched him, she felt him flinch, as if kindness had become foreign to him. You be free, she said simply. The word hung between them like a benediction. Free from the endless pursuit, free from the weight of vengeance, free from the cycle of violence that had already claimed too much. Clara thought about Jake in his final days, how he'd sometimes reach for her hand in the dark and held it like it was the only anchor keeping him from drowning in his regrets. I can't give you back your brother, Clara continued, her thumb tracing gentle circles across Thomas's knuckles. I can't undo what Jake did or take away the pain you've carried. But I can tell you that my husband died sorry. Genuinely, deeply sorry for the choice he made and the life he took. And I can tell you that the man who killed Billy wasn't the man you married, Thomas replied. The Jake Morrison I sat with in that boarding house was broken by what he'd done. He spoke of you like you were something sacred, something he'd been afraid to touch with his blood-stained hands. Outside, the wind began to die down, leaving only the soft crackle of the fire and the distant sound of night birds calling to one another across the prairie. Clara felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of bonds she hadn't even known were there. "I want to show you something," she said, releasing Thomas's hand and standing slowly. She walked to the wooden chest beside her bed, the one that held her most precious possessions. From beneath folded quilts and carefully preserved letters, she drew out a small leather journal. "Jake kept this," she said, returning to the table. "I found it after he died, hidden beneath a loose floorboard. I think he wanted me to find it eventually." She opened the journal to a page near the end, her finger tracing the familiar slant of Jake's handwriting. The words were cramped and hurried, as if he'd been afraid he might not have time to finish them. "If something happens to me," she read aloud, "I want Clara to know that she was the best part of my life. Every good thing I ever did was because of her love, and every bad thing I did was in spite of it. I made a terrible mistake in Dodge City. Killed a boy who didn't deserve to die, destroyed families that didn't deserve the pain. I've tried to live with it, try to make amends in small ways, but some sins are too big for a man to carry alone. If my past catches up to me, I hope whoever comes looking will understand that the worst punishment I could receive is knowing I've brought shame to the woman I love." Thomas listened with his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. When Clara finished reading, she closed the journal gently and set it beside the gun. "He loved you," Thomas said through his tears. "Whatever else he was, whatever he'd done, he loved you truly. And you loved Billy." Clara picked up the gun, feeling its weight in her hands for the first time. It was heavier than she'd expected and colder. That love doesn't have to die with them. She stood and walked to the door, Thomas following behind her. The prairie stretched out endless and dark under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch. The wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, the eternal smell of hope on the frontier. Without ceremony, Clara drew back her arm and threw the gun as far as she could into the darkness. It disappeared into the night with barely a sound, swallowed by the vastness of the land that had witnessed so much violence and so much sorrow. "It's finished," she said, not sure if she was speaking to Thomas or to Jake's ghost or to the wind itself. Thomas stood beside her on the porch, and for the first time since he'd knocked on her door, he looked peaceful. The lines around his eyes had softened, and his shoulders no longer carried the rigid set of a man at war with the world. "What happens now?" he asked, echoing her question from the night before. Clara looked out at the dark prairie, at the land that would need tending come spring, at the cabin that had known too much loneliness and too many secrets. Then she looked at Thomas, this broken man who had found his way to her door, carrying justice in his heart, and had chosen to leave it buried in the dust instead. "Now we figure out how to live," she said. "Together, if you're willing. This land is too hard for one person alone, and I think we've both spent enough time carrying our burdens without help." Thomas turned to study her face in the starlight. "You trust me? After everything, you came here seeking vengeance and chose mercy instead. You sat with a dying man and gave him the gift of forgiveness in his final hours. You threw away 3 years of anger because you believed it was what your brother would have wanted." Clara smiled, and it felt like the first genuine smile she'd worn since Jake's death. "Yes, Thomas Whitmore. I think I can trust you." As the first light of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon, they stood together on the porch of a cabin that had been a house of secrets and was now becoming something new. The wind carried away the dust of old sorrows, making room for whatever would grow in the rich soil of forgiveness. And in that moment, both of them understood that sometimes the greatest mercy is not getting what we think we deserve, but receiving what we never dare to hope for: a second chance at grace.